You are listening to the Berry Thoughtful Life Coaching Podcast with the mindset coach, Kanisha Berry. You will be empowered, uplifted, and encouraged. Now, here's your host, Kanisha.
Hello, Berry Thoughtfuls. So today I am teaching on one of my favorite scriptures. It's the Bible scripture that tells us, do not be conformed to the patterns of this world, but to renew our minds, that we may know the will of God for our life. Like, can you imagine knowing God's will for your life? Listen, I don't teach this because I perfected it. I teach it because I believe it. And I know in God's economy, belief is currency, right? Faith is currency in God's economy. And so I have faith that when I do everything I can to renew my mind, that there will be attached to it a promise. Right? The promise is that I will know God's will. And I know that there are scriptures that tell me that his perfect and pleasing will is that I prosper and that, I have a long life. I know that these are some of the promises that God offers us. So today I want to encourage you to begin to consider and think about what are the patterns in your life. See, the word tells us to be transformed, but it also tells us not to be conformed to the patterns of this world. And what I've learned in my own life is that there were patterns. There were financial patterns that I had been taught since the time I was a child, not intentionally, unintentionally. But it was the way I learned. It was the way I thought of money. And I thought of money as something that I was never going to have enough of, that no matter what I do, I couldn't get it. And that even when I had it, it was never enough. And so these were the patterns. And then I began to be intentional about learning about money, like learning how to manage a budget, kind of like, giving my money an address even before I got it, knowing where my money goes. And I saw how just learning, renewing my mind in that area, my husband and I, we began to see our life prosper. Like we've been amazed at the opportunities and the doors that have opened in our finances because we were able to renew our mind. Also, we did that in our marriage. See, when we first started marriage, we bought into kind of the fairy tale ideal of marriage. We did marriage the way the world said do it. We began to try to have the things that the world said we should have. It wasn't about consulting God. It was about getting things, and it was about accomplishing things, and it was about doing it the world's way, and buy the house, buy the car, have the so-called success the world said we should have, pursue the kind of jobs that the world said we would have. But that wasn't working for my husband and I. And so what do? We finally actually, it was one of those God moments where God will get your attention by destroying everything. And that happened. And so instead of allowing the disruption in our life to lead us to anger, sadness, and bitterness, we decided to transform. And we transformed our marriage by learning God's way, his thinking of marriage. I had to learn how to honor and respect my husband. I had to learn that in God's economy, that my obedience to him, being to God, meant to submit to my husband. But I must first submit to God so that I could submit to my husband. And so under that currency of my obedience is another currency with God. He began to honor that situation. He began to provide the promises that he said he would because he is God. Also under that currency, my husband began to love me as he loved his own body. But guess where that started? It started with him learning how to love himself the way God loved him so that he could love me the way God called him to love me. Because again, in God's currency, obedience is currency. In God's economy, obedience is currency. So we had to begin to learn to be obedient to what God called us to do, to learn to renew our mind, our thinking about marriage, about love, about relationships through the way God tells us to have relationships, not through the way the world has taught us. So if you are in a place where you are exhausted with the way you're thinking or the way your life is panning out, like if you keep having bad relationships, if your money is a mess, if your attitude is all over the place, if your mind is unquiet, if you're just exhausted with the outcomes that you're having because you can't seem to produce the life that God promised, I promise you, somewhere in your thinking, there is a renewing of the mind that needs to take place. And if you need help with that, please get help. One of the things I do as a mindset coach is I help my clients begin to identify their mental patterns that are creating for them a way of thinking that's causing them to create a messy life. So if you're really committed to doing the work and you want someone to work with you, feel free to go to my website, berrythoughtfullife.com. Send me a message and say, hey, Kenesha, I'm ready to start the work. This is how we begin to awaken to all that God called us to be, and so that we can begin to know His perfect and pleasing will for our life. Thank you so much for listening. I am Kenesha Berry with berrythoughtfullife.com.